to tell y'all right now, all of these wonderful people would not be here without Patreon supporters like you. If you enjoy credible news, reviews, and commentary on UFOs and UAPs 5 days a week, you want to support this show. What's your name? Marty. Marty, look how easy this is, Marty. Pick up your phone. Boom! You're a Patreon member. I mean, look, it's so easy. You just click the link, which is right here. Just for $1 a month, you can support this show. Just fill out the information and pledge what's comfortable for you. It could be $1, $5, $10, or who knows. Just support.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I checked. I'm not muted this time, so you can all hear me. Welcome to another episode of Known Quantities. I'm your host, Daniel Miller, bringing the conversation of science, UAP, technology, journalism closer together. Today, we have a fantastic guest that I am so excited to speak to, Graeme Rendall. He wrote an amazing book about Foo-Fighters. Before we get right into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. I just want to let you all know and remind you all that this is also a podcast. All of the UCR shows are, as well as Singularity Lab. So make sure to rate, review, like, follow, whether on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a big difference. In terms of supporting our channel, we are a public access channel, which means we are supported by viewers and listeners like you. So that means we have Patreons for all of the hosts here, including me. You can find those links down below. Your support is so appreciated. We also have Super Chat. That's another great way to support the show. If you have a burning question, those are open and available to you, and I'll make a point to get to those and ask the host, or if it's a question to me, and make sure I answer them. Make sure to like and subscribe on this channel. They really make a difference. Ring that bell if you haven't yet, so you can get reminded as you're aware if you're here. We are starting today at a special time at 1 p.m. instead of the usual 4 p.m. So those bells will make sure you're not flat-footed and missing out on a show. Special thanks and shout out to DOS Tapes for the grooving music. That is just, I'm jiving to right now as I talk to you. Also special thanks to Blue Marlin Chronicles, bluemarlinchronicles.com. And of course, we have a merch store. Fantastic merch. Rather yesterday, thought of a good idea about a jump to conclusions mat. I'm pretty down with that. I also like the idea of mental gymnastics workout shirt or shorts. Shorts could work too. Yeah, I'm into that. Great. Well, I've spoken enough. Without further ado, everybody, I want to bring on our special guest today. Graeme Rendall is a contributor to the Debrief and UAP Media UK and a frequent guest on podcasts looking at the UAP issue. Graeme has completed an eagerly anticipated book dealing with the Foo-Fighters of World War II. He has been an aviation and World War II history enthusiast from an early age when he was given model aircraft kits to keep him quiet. He lives with his wife in rural Northumberland, hope I didn't butcher that name, in between the beach and the hills. And without further ado, Graeme, welcome, sir. Welcome to Known Quantities.
Hello, Danny. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Oh, I'm happy. Seem to be riding the crest of a wave at the moment, so I couldn't be better. Thank you.
You are. Congratulations on Coast to Coast recently. You know, I always makes me happy when people do good work. Their voice and the attention gets spread out to the masses, because I know that place has a big audience. So that makes me very happy to hear.
It was it was a bit of a roller coaster ride, that, because originally it was set up for mid-September, but I was actually on holiday, so it's been in the works for about 6 weeks. So I've been eagerly anticipating it, and it was getting closer and closer. I was getting more butterflies in my stomach, sort of thing. So I'm actually pleased to have it out of the way, but I'm also pleased to have done it as well, because George was incredibly gracious to give me the invitation, but also the questions he asked were really good, and his backroom staff were brilliant as well with me. So I couldn't fault the process whatsoever.
Great. That's great news. Well, we're here today because you have written this book, this tome, I should say, that is has incredible work behind it. This is UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo-Fighters, 1940-1945. The cover by Olaf Rockner and Dan Zitterstrom, I believe, collaborated on this.
That's right.
I already had the Kindle version, but I had to have a print copy as well, because just the cover alone, I mean, I want to frame this. This is so cool.
Well, funny enough, you can actually get prints from Dan because he's selling prints, and all
Is he now?
proceeds are going to Project Galileo.
Fantastic. I love that idea. That's fantastic. For those who may not know, Project Galileo is a project that was started by Avi Loeb from the Harvard, who used to be the chair of the astronomy department at Harvard. And he got some private funding. So he created this project in order to try to collect some data on the UAP phenomenon, in case people are wondering what the heck that was. So let's get right into it. I am curious, I guess, before we even get to the book, what your history is and how your interest kind of stumbled upon this topic in general.
Yeah, certainly. As you said before, I'm an aviation enthusiast, and certainly from a very early age, my mother bought me, as you say, aircraft kits, little model aircraft kits to keep me quiet when I was 4 or 5 years old. And each kit, apart from the instructions how to build it, had a little kind of potted history of the aircraft that you were building. So it was only a couple of paragraphs, but it was enough to stimulate my interest, because when I was young, I was a sponge. Like a lot of kids, you get your nose buried into an encyclopedia, and then you get to the end of the bit there, but you want to know more. You want to know more than what's beyond the book itself. And that was me. So I would get another book and I'd read that cover to cover. And of course, that wasn't enough either. So I'd read all the books in the library about airplanes, but very quickly, the ones that were for my age group, I started reading ones which are for a more adult audience, because I was a quick study, and it just went from there. Now, the same happened in science fiction, so I started reading that when I was quite early, about 7 or 8 years old. I was reading Harry Harrison's The Stainless Steel Rat. I was reading Isaac Asimov's books at about that age, and my mother bought me what she thought was a science fiction book because it had a spacecraft on the front of it, a flying saucer, and she thought it was another one of these books. Except it wasn't. It was Mysterious Visitors by Brinsley Lapoa Trench, who was a UK author. He was actually a sitting House of Lords member, funnily enough, but he was also a UFO enthusiast, and he wrote a number of books in the 60s and 70s. And this happened to be one that was published in the early 1970s, because I'm a child. I was born in the 1960s. I'm quite old. Anyway, so that got one of the two maybe. That piqued my interest in a big way, because all these things I've been reading about as fiction, so science fiction, seem to be fact. Because apparently we had spacecraft visiting the Earth and had done so since the time of the Bible, etc. So it was quite, mind-altering, really, for me, because this was something that was really going to stimulate my interest, and that's where that started from. So again, I went through the same cycle, get all the books from the library, read all I can, assimilate all that information, because I still wasn't prepared to make any kind of decision on it, even though the books at that time seemed to be a case of they were full of stories of lights moving in the sky, therefore that must be aliens. There seemed to be a little, too little critical thinking about the conclusions people were drawing from very limited data. And that didn't sit well with me, even at a very early age. So, as I got older, I kept looking for books that, had more analysis, had more information, and didn't sort of jump to conclusions, much like the kind of people I hang around with now, if you like, and the kind of shows I listen to and the documentaries I watch and the books I read, fall into that kind of bracket. I don't want to be told they're from Zeta Reticuli. I don't want to be told about, kind of huge conspiracies like this, because I just simply don't believe it unless somebody, gives me proper evidence. So this is where I'm coming from, basically. And of course, the book I've written is a book I wanted to read myself, but such a thing didn't exist. Yes, people have actually looked at the Foo-Fighters in the past, but for a long time, it was treated as a very kind of narrow window of time and a very narrow spread in terms of geography in the war. And therefore, it wasn't really reported too much because of this very limited phenomena. And then in the 1990s, there's a few more cases out. Keith Chester, who I've actually been in contact with over the last few weeks, he wrote a book in 2007 called Strange Company, which was probably the pioneering effort in terms of trying to cover the Foo Fighter phenomenon as a whole right across the wall. And it was a good stab. I mean, he himself says that it was a kind of early effort, and he's got mistakes in it. Well, it does, unfortunately. And that was something I wanted to try and address. So that's where the kind of germ of the idea of the book came from, all that history that I've had, looking at stuff, analyzing stuff, thinking that not that I could do better, that's too arrogant, just that there was a gap that needed to be filled.
And
if I wasn't going to do it, nobody else was going to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, as I was reading the book, I'll confess I haven't even finished it yet. I think I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Really taking my time with it. And as I'm reading it, I'd heard the Foo Fighters, and I will confess I'm relatively new to this topic. I've always been very curious, and I'm a huge fan of science, and I also a sci-fi fan, but never considered this an actual possibility. And then when I think the recent news, circa 2019, kind of was a rude awakening for me. And Leslie Kean's book, I was a really big fan of, because it was not, this is from Zeta Reticuli, or this is what that is. It was just saying, this is what happened. Here are the witnesses. Here are the reports. Here's the documentation. Here's the evidence. I'm not going to tell you what to make of that, but I think it's important that you know that, right? And I feel like you have done an earlier history version of Leslie Kean's book. You really have. I think you've amassed an incredible account of witness testimony and documents we get more into in a bit. And I was kind of honestly flabbergasted. My poor girlfriend, I was just reading it. I was like, this is crazy. I just kept on being like, you don't understand. Like, this has been here so long. And you hear the stories of Foo Fighters, but with my brief Googling back in the last year and a half, you can't find very much substantial stories, or it's just kind of like, like from a saucer magazine from the 60s or something from the 1990s. And so when I read this, I thought, my goodness, this has just been this topic that it's been there, but no one's really taken the time and effort to actually sift through and comb through everything. So what was it like that when you decided you wanted to do this topic? UFO podcast, yes, amazing book. And
my friend Andy, thank you.
Yes, an amazing podcast, guys. If you have not listened to Andy's podcast, it is must listen. It's fantastic. I'm curious, when you decided you wanted to do this book, how did you go about starting? How did you say, okay, I want to do this. Now I have to just sift through this massive collection of documents to find references to these sightings? How did you even go about starting that?
Well, I'll go even further back if I can, Danny, just for a little diversion, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
If I go back to the days where I was reading books myself, so I was just getting into the topic, like you've just said you are. Mm-hmm. I knew at an early age that there was a gap in World War II in terms of reporting of phenomena, because it started with, the books either started with, say, the mystery airships of 1897, and then went into the ghost aircraft of about the 1920s and 1930s, and then skipped forward to 1946 with the ghost rockets, and then 47 with Roswell and Kenneth Arnold. And there was this, this kind of hiatus, this gap in the middle where seemingly nothing happened. Or, if you were lucky, you got a few reports from the Foo Fighters from November 44, December, and then the first few months of 1945, and occasionally a couple of stories from the Pacific, if you were very, very lucky and the author had decided to include them. Now, I'm not blaming these people from the 70s and 80s, because funny enough, all they had was a very limited set of reports to go on. And you have to cast your mind back to the end of the war and just shortly afterwards, where there was actually only a little bit of information in the public realm. And in December 1945, a former aide to General Hap Arnold, who was the commander-in-chief of the US Army Air Force during World War II, his aide had been sent on a fact-finding mission around Belgium and France, looking at staff welfare in terms of the Army Air Force units, and he'd also been embedded with the troops. The air bases, as you were. And he'd spoke to the people in the night fighter units, and he'd heard the stories, because that's where all the American stories came out, or the night fighter stories came out. And of course, that must have touched a nerve somehow, because later that year, in December 45, he managed to get published in American Legion magazine, which is some kind of forces newspaper magazine type effort, a story called The Foo Fighter Mystery. And you can find that online. It's freely available, so people can do a search for this. And the chap's name was called Joe Chamberlain. It's J.O. Chamberlain, without an A at the end. And it has about half a dozen stories from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, who were based in eastern France in the winter of 44-45, 2 stories from the Pacific, and 1 from a daylight fighter squadron operating over Germany about the same time. And that was it. So you've got 9 stories, which basically was the sum total, effectively, of Foo Fighters stories up until about the mid-90s, with a few small exceptions. Wow. If you subscribe to likes of Flying Saucer Review from the UK or some other periodicals in the US, which were very limited run, so you're only, you're talking about a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000 or more, sort of thing, very, very niche publications, then there was a couple of stories trickled out of these. And then when you got into the 1980s, people like Tim Good in the UK was putting 1 or 2 stories in, and some other books. You got a handful of stories. Now, to me, when I started reading some of these, even in the 80s and even into the early 90s, that sort of set alarm bells ring with me, because you saw this wealth of reports from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 70s, from civilian airliner crews and military aircraft crews and pilots seeing strange craft. And there was a huge number of reports. And yet I knew, because of what I've learned about World War II, that there was tens of thousands of people flying around the skies at night and in the daytime. But hold on, there's only 9 reports. And a few bolted on afterwards. That doesn't make sense. So, even so, my critical thinking kind of thing will hold on. Where are these extra reports? Turns out there were some extra reports. And when I read Keith Chester's book in 2007, that opened the floodgates to me, because there were signs that there was definitely other stuff in the records. You just had to go and look through them. So it needed somebody to go and dive into the RAF record, the Royal Air Force records, because although Keith Chester had actually touched on some of them, they were few and far between. He'd more delved into the American records because he was an American author, and that's obviously stands to reason. And it's easier for people your side of the pond to do that research than it is from people across here, and vice versa. But that's where I started from. So I started diving into our national archives, and that's where I began.
Wow, that's fantastic. So of course, your knowledge of of aviation, its history, I'm sure it was a huge advantage for you. These orbs kept on coming up, which is a funny, kind of ironically named for those, consider what they're seeing. What did that stand for?
Yeah, so that's operations record book. So effectively, each squadron, each unit in the Royal Air Force had 2 ORBs for each month of the war that they were operating. So one was a record of events, so a record of each mission that was flown by each aircraft, usually, and the other was a kind of summary of events for a month, which was more behind the scenes kind of stuff that happened in the squadron. So posting ins, posting outs of aircrew, crashes, other things that happened on the squadron. But combined, those 2 files for each month for each squadron are a mine of information. You just have to know where to look, and you have to know which squadron was based where and when and all this kind of stuff. Happily, I do know that kind of information. I have access to it, so it was easier to dig out the records out of the archives than it might be for somebody who was interested in UFOs but wasn't necessarily cognizant with that kind of information.
Of course. So I guess let's give some people who are listening, or who maybe haven't heard one of your interviews yet, kind of maybe say one of your favorite sightings, kind of just lay out the groundwork for what one of those sightings would be like.
Okay, yeah. Okay, there's a few I've talked about. I'll come up with one that happened in November 1942. Sure. So the American Air Force had just got into the war, effectively. I know it had been like nearly a year since Pearl Harbor, but in terms of the 8th Air Force sending aircraft across to Europe and across to Britain, rather, then it was still early days. They'd still yet to send aircraft across Germany, because that wouldn't happen until 3 months' time in 1943. But they were starting to do things like anti-submarine patrols over the Bay of Biscay, which is a stretch of water to the south of Britain, just off the coast of France and Spain. It's that kind of little kind of bay of land between the 2 countries. Now, that was a place where U-boats were operating from bases in France, and they was trying to sink our convoys going from Britain across to Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. So it was quite a dangerous area for our ships. And we sent aircraft across from Cornwall, which is in the southwest of England, the far tip of southwest England, from air bases there to actually try and attack submarines, usually when they're on the surface, and depth charge them. Now, the Americans got into that game in November 1942, and they first sent actually Air Force aircraft, not US Navy aircraft, but Air Force aircraft. They were the first ones to do that patrol for 6 months. And the first unit, in the first days they were actually based in Cornwall, one of their aircraft came across what the crew described as a huge craft without wings that came up behind their aircraft. And this is, over the sea. And this thing just appeared behind them at a distance, but they could see it. Now, this craft, they didn't know what it was, but chances are they leapt to the conclusion that it was a German secret weapon because, as I keep saying, what else would they think it would be? The words UFO, alien, extraterrestrials, those didn't feature back then. People didn't talk about that kind of thing. Exactly. Everything in the war was going to be a new weapon. It was just a question of when it came out and what it would do. So the crew looked at it and they were all on the intercom, shouting to each other from position to position on the aircraft saying, what the hell is this thing? And actually there was a technical sergeant on the airplane who was only known by his initials FMB. And bearing in mind, the witness was CJJ, who was the ball turret gunner. So it was a B-24 Liberator bomber, which was a 4-engine aircraft, which had a gun turret above. It had a ball turret underneath the aircraft. It had a tail gun and a nose gun. And so this technical sergeant, and I don't even know which position he filled in the aircraft, but he had a camera, and he took pictures of it. So one particular picture apparently is perfect, according to the witness. It was classed as, the kind of clearest image you could take of an object. But nobody knows what happened to these pictures. So, however, when they got back to base, then, the report was filed, presumably. The pictures would have been developed, but they'd been whisked away. Now, according to the sighting, this object came behind the aircraft, followed them from some distance. I don't know from the information I've got as to whether they try to do some kind of invasive maneuvering, but chances are they would have, because that would be standard procedure. But after a while, this craft, whatever it was, did a 180-degree turn and just shot off in the distance. So make of that what you will.
God, I can only imagine how stressful that. I mean, you paint a great picture with these pilots, just what the being in the plane is like, and you see something that looks unfamiliar. You think that thing is there to kill me, and so I can only imagine the sheer intensity of seeing this thing, not knowing what it is doing things you can't understand, you haven't seen. You think it's a secret weapon that the Germans or someone has created, and it's going to kill me. And this
the thing is, sorry, just to break in there, Danny. The thing about this particular case is they didn't open fire at it, even though they probably could have, because the tail gunner would have had a good, kind of bead on it, and chances are the ball turret gunner would have had as well. So there's a certain amount of restraint being shown there, but bearing in mind they were probably only in theatre for a few days when that incident occurred in terms of flying operational missions, and that could have been a factor. And I didn't actually put that in the book, but looking back, that probably may have been the reason that they were fairly new, fairly inexperienced, and weren't even sure what they were looking at. Most things would have been couched in the terms of, yes, it was a German secret weapon. Certainly if that had been an RAF crew, that's what they would have, sort of worked out, because they would have been doing that kind of those missions long before the Americans turned up. But, and that's no reflection on the American crew itself, of course. But, it's just the way it was. The ones at night, definitely that was standard procedure. If a light came up behind your aircraft, you waited until it got into range and you just opened fire at it. There was no, you had no questions. That's what you did. And of course, that sort of thing did happen. So.
And that's worth mentioning, because I mean, I guess now that you think about it, it's obvious, but I was never really thought about the fact that we have opened fire on these things, because you think of the, the Iranian incident, or there's rumors of pilots maybe getting their jets malfunctioning in Russia or something. You've heard anecdotal things on that side, but we opened fire. The Allies opened fire on these things, and I guess just tell me what. I know I'm leading the witness here, but what happened when they fired upon them?
So in the case that happened in March 1942, which is depicted on the cover of the book, the bullets did nothing. They just entered the light that was the pilot and the crew could see, and it didn't. The bullets and the tracer rounds didn't come out the other side. They seemed, for want of a better expression, to be absorbed by the light. And if that had been some kind of craft or a German aircraft, it would have had chunks taken out of it from the bullets, and it would have caught fire, or it would have fell away in flames. But none of that happened. It just moved around to the front of the aircraft and then sped off in the distance. Now, in other cases, the fighter aircraft were firing 20mm, cannon shells at lights that they were following or managing to get on their tails, again with no observable result. Now, later on in the war, there were cases of what the gunners described as small bat-winged aircraft that they were opening fire on, and they were actually allegedly shooting them down in flames, or other things, lights as well, that they were shooting at, that again they were saying were going down. But how you have to sort of take with a pinch of salt some of these stories, but also I can't reconcile them to any kind of German technology either. So it's very, very strange. What happens. So there's a bit of a progression there, but you don't get the same outcomes as you did later, after the war, where, as you mentioned, there's anecdotal stories of Russian MiG-17 and MiG-19 pilots being sort of downed by craft. And there's also a story, I believe, of a Cuban MiG-21 pilot who suffered the same fate. So, there are stories of people, suffering with their lives. And of course, you have to think about the Thomas Mantell case. Also the F-18-9 that crashed over the Great Lakes. There's quite a few stories, that end with the death and destruction of the aircraft and the pilot.
Right. And I think it's important to note too that these incidents, these sightings are not a few and far in between. It's one thing to think, oh, maybe they're under duress, it's combat, they're seeing flares, and this was prevalent to a degree that I had never realized. Did you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, they knew what the flares were like, because you have to remember that these pilots became quite experienced very quickly. And
Absolutely.
If you're flying over Germany or other targets night after night, you get an idea very quickly what things look like. So you know what your own targeting flares look like, because they had Pathfinder aircraft which would drop flares on targets, and there were different colors, so that other aircraft coming behind them could drop their bombs on the same place. They got to know extremely quickly what these things look like. The Germans used decoy flares to try and lure aircraft away from targets. The same kind of thing, but you knew what they looked like. There were other things that like flashed and banged and all the rest of it in the skies that they got quickly accustomed to recognizing. They also knew what aircraft looked like, both theirs and the enemy's. So all this stuff was fairly common to them. It was the stuff that was out of the ordinary. That was the things that got reported. Now, occasionally it crops up in the squadron, the logs, in the ORBs, as you mentioned before, but sometimes it doesn't. And you can only get those stories from the pilot testimonies, usually long after the war. So, you have to read between the lines, because, as you say, there's lots of reports, and there are a huge amount of reports in the files. You just have to find them. But then you also have to wonder how many weren't reported, because sometimes there's fairly shoddy reporting in terms of the lack of detail in some of these squadron reports. And I've also noticed the same in some of the American files I looked at. They're better in some respects for the daylight missions in terms of picking up on some of this weird and wonderful stuff. But they also have blind spots where you hear from pilots and whatever that there's been things seen, and then when you look at the unit records, you can't find any kind of trace of it. So you have to wonder how much is not being reported for whatever reason.
Right. And stigma. I mean, you have people saying, oh, you've been drinking, and they don't want their careers at risk. That's a whole other factor that make you wonder how many things we've missed in terms of documentation just because people don't want to deal with it.
I think stigma is a big thing. I mean, everybody knows about the stigma nowadays in terms of the US Air Force and airline pilots around the world have been encouraged not to talk about this issue for years. It's been the class as a career-ending move. And people forget that actually that sort of state of affairs happened in World War II as well. Because if you started reporting things like that, not only did you get stick from your colleagues on the squadron, because they thought you were going nuts, but you also ran the risk of being declared unfit to fly. And that, in the RAF, if you tried to make on that you didn't want to fly, what they declared you was lack of moral fiber, which was effectively putting a white feather in your cap and saying you were a coward. Now, I knew you had a different way of doing things in the American Air Force, but that's the way it worked in the RAF. If you said, I don't want to fly anymore, then you were basically labeled a coward. You were stripped down to the ranks, and you basically mopped floors for the rest of the war if you didn't get thrown into prison. So there was a lot of things happened that people didn't want to report things because of the possible repercussions. At the very least, you would suffer like names and nicknames and just get a lot of stick from your colleagues. But at worst, it could be really bad for you. And of course, the Americans as well had that. So. But still, people came forward because they thought they should, because, again, there was this kind of thing where it could be a German secret weapon. And therefore, the intelligence people, in the end, did actually want to know what was going on, but they couldn't understand what was going on.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. If it's one thing to think a German weapon, but if you think there's no way this is, I can totally understand the mental calculus of saying, what do I have to gain by reporting this? Because it's not German and they're not going to do anything about it. And I put my career potentially at risk. I mean, I don't know if I would have said something. So it makes perfect sense. Well, real quick, we're about halfway through. I'm just going to reset the room really fast here, Graeme. Bear with me. If you're just tuning in, guys, I'm speaking with a lovely Graeme Rendall, who is a contributor to the Debrief and UAP Media UK and a frequent guest on podcasts looking at the UAP issue. Graeme has completed an eagerly anticipated book dealing with the Foo-Fighters of World War II, and he has been an aviation and World War II history enthusiast from an early age when he was given model aircraft kits to keep him quiet. He lives with his wife in rural Northumberland and between the beach and the hills. And also, I want to do a brief shout out to Jazz Shaw, who I believe has been at the hospital today with the missus. Hope everything's okay. Sending you all lots of love from everyone here, the UCR crew. Yes. I wanted you. So the shapes of these things, I always thought they were just orbs of light, but your book includes upturned bathtubs. I mean, giant blankets, like cylinders with portholes. I mean, it really runs the gamut. Could you just kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So everybody knows the kind of things that were seen after the war. So you've got all shapes and all sizes. And really, World War II was a bit of a microcosm in terms of, what was being seen of everything that was going to come afterwards. So yes, you did get, as you say, like kind of orbs of light that, nobody really knew the size or the what was behind them, if there was anything behind them at all. But you had, the bathtub comes from the Battle of Krasny Bor in February 1943, where there was a battle going on between the Russians and the Germans just outside Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and it was a 3-day battle, funny enough. But on the first day, there was actually a battle going on the ground between the ground forces. There was also a battle in the air between the two air forces, and then above them was this what they called an upturned bathtub, which seemed to be watching everything that was going on, and then it suddenly flew off. Then you've got there was a 200 or 300 foot, I wasn't entirely sure how big, but it was enormous, torpedo-shaped long object, which had 2 rows of red lights along its side. And that was seen over northern Italy in November 1942. It was seen twice on the same mission by the same crew. The second time was flying along a mountain valley in the Alps. So, you make of that what you will. And then you've got Zeppelin-shaped objects, which are seen by people on the ground in Czechoslovakia in 1944. You've got disc-shaped kind of lights, which are quite large, not just small orbs flying around. You name it, it's almost being seen. French civilians were seeing like strange things that were flying around, strange shapes. There was something that looked like a funnel cloud that aircraft apparently were flying around and then dropping out the sky because their engines were failing. That's another story that comes from there. There was a landed craft that had been buried in sand dunes that had 2 revolving rings around its circumference that apparently took off in front of a witness. So, there's all these different shapes, all these different sizes. And it's not just also the different sizes and the different shapes. You've got a great geographical spread as well. So, yes, when you saw these early reports up until about the mid-90s, people thought everything was just concentrated in a couple of places, that it was just over a triangle of land between Cologne, Dusseldorf, and the Belgian and French border, or it was in northern Italy because there've been sightings there as well over the Po Valley. But actually, if you read through the book that I've written, you'll see that there were stories that involve cases from the North Cape of Norway down to North Africa, and then across from the Eastern Front across to the Bay of Biscay, which I mentioned before. So that's everywhere in Europe. I even heard of actually cases which happened in Britain, but I didn't include those because I wanted more focus on what we were doing abroad rather than kind of a home thing. And the stories that I got from the UK, I couldn't trace much. So I didn't want to put things in the book that I couldn't really dig into anyway, because I don't like, just chucking things in where it's, somebody saw a light in the sky, but that doesn't really get you anywhere. So I wanted a bit more than that kind of thing, you see. So, but there are stories from the UK as well.
Wow. Real quick, thank you, Christina Gomez, for the $5 super chat. Christina has an amazing channel herself, guys. She's all over the place. She's got Mysteries of the History. She also works for the Debrief, has some great news recap videos, as well as her own channel. So check her stuff out, guys. Big shout out to Graeme, and kudos to Matthew McConaughey, aka Danny Miller. All right. I'll take that compliment. Thank you very much. when I hear these accounts, and these are accounts of not just one person, these are bomber crews or crews in multiple ships. It's kind of a feeling that I'm sure everyone is getting, that just, you kind of just can only shake your head and think, what the heck? Like, what the heck is going on? And your book also mentions that these dark black ships that also are coming up against these pilots that are, it just kind of blows my mind of how, given that with this topic, even when the New Yorker is really writing about it, it seems like most of this starts with Kenneth Arnold in 1947, right? Yet here we have these accounts that are, by all accounts, far more insane than just a pilot seeing 7 ships kind of dance really quickly insane. I mean, we're firing on these things. They look weird. They're in our combat zones, and it's worth mentioning that I think some people think, oh, these things are checking out our, whatever they may be, are looking at us fighting. But you also have to keep in mind that same with today, when we're catching a lot of these unidentified incursions in our training ranges have sensors up the wazoo. We can track every little thing that's going on. It also makes you wonder whether we're seeing these things because we have a bunch of planes in the sky every single day that are fighting combat missions. So
yeah, I think the case in the war was because there was simply tens of thousands of people flying both at night and also through the day, and therefore there's more eyes looking in the sky. There were anti-aircraft gunners on the ground looking at the skies every night. So there are reports that I've got in the book from people like that. But just generally, people were active and curious and watching because they had to be on alert all the time for obvious reasons. So people were bound to see things, and there were official reporting mechanisms for things that were out of the ordinary because you needed intelligence. It was a vital war-winning tool. So you can understand why this is one of probably the first times in history that all the kind of bits of the puzzle were together in order to try and report on things which were anomalous. Yes, okay, we'd had reports in the First World War and different times in history, but they're quite patchy and they're quite few and far between and fragmented. But this is one time when everything seemed to come together. And yes, it's before Roswell, but everybody seems to latch on to that, and Kenneth Arnold, and because for 50 years, it was drilled into people that was the start of modern ufology, and it's going to be a hard habit to break, unfortunately. Now, I'm not trying to sort of reinvent the wheel here and say, look, it's not that. You have to listen to me. I'm not, I'm nowhere near that arrogant. But what I'm suggesting is that people maybe should just take a look at the earlier reports and the ghost rockets as well of 1946, because that's a phenomenon. Micah Hanks wrote a really good book on that subject, detailing all what had transpired in Scandinavia. In fact, they actually happened elsewhere in Europe as well at the time. But so things happened and quite widespread geographically in World War II. I don't cover them in the book, but they covered the Pacific as well, the Far East, off Alaska, west coast of America, different places. Right through that period. So you can't really just say that modern ufology started in 47, because actually, no, it didn't. It started much earlier. Now, you can debate the reasons why that might be the case. I can't give you those answers, unfortunately, but there's definitely a hell of a lot of data there to go through.
There is, which, not to get too off topic, but it's a little, it is frustrating to see how the recent intelligence report from the ODNI kind of starts the beginning of that topic at 2004 with the Nimitz, it would seem, when there, it's historically decades of data. So it's interesting that there seems to be, hopefully that will change in legislation. It look like it'll change. Red Panda Koala has a question. Curious about Graham's take on the alleged star airships of the late 1800s. The question I was actually going to ask you as well. Obviously we can only really guess, but do you have any idea or feeling whether this might be a manifestation of the same thing? Or
I tend not to make guesses, but I do occasionally offer theories which I think about, but which I wouldn't sort of put bet my house on. So here's one for this, and this is something I've mentioned before elsewhere. I do get the idea that in different times of history, it seems like they're just ahead of us. So the airships in the 1890s, like 1896, 1897, were, somewhat ahead, but not that much further ahead about, human technology in the airships we had then, and then we had going into the beginning of the First World War. So, it was markedly different because they could do maneuvers that seemingly the ones that were built couldn't. And then you get into the 1920s and 1930s and the ghost aircraft that were flying around in snowstorms and thick fog and had like these huge, powerful searchlights that seemed to be going around, were much more advanced than the aircraft we had back then. And, our pilots would never fly in those kind of conditions because they'd crash and they'd kill themselves. And then, of course, you get into World War II and it seems to advance even further because the capabilities of some of these things that have been reported are way and above of even the most, aerodynamic and fastest aircraft that the humankind could actually produce. And they're actually German, because the Germans had the fastest aircraft in World War II, which was the rocket-powered Messerschmitt 163 Comet, but it could only do 1,000 kilometers an hour. And then if it did that, it used to pitch into a vertical dive and crash because it wasn't built to go supersonic. But these things could run rings around those kind of aircraft if they tried, because they certainly did that around Allied aircraft. And then, of course, you get into the 50s and 60s, and then you've got this kind of, sort of dimensional shift between the kind of capabilities of our jet fighters and these things. And then look at the Tic Tac. There's the modern day example, how quickly that could move in 60 miles from, in a matter of seconds. So they're just ahead, or there's a increasing gap between ours and their capabilities. If there is a theirs, I don't like to sort of say there's definitely something going on. This is definitely that. I deal in a bit of a kind of like maybe kind of thing, because I don't like to sort of bet my shirt on something, because invariably, If I do, I'll be wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. There's, it's a very low information zone, this entire topic. There's some things we know for sure, but the majority of it, we kind of can just shrug. Well, you brought up...
Well, that's it, yeah. I mean, sorry, George Knapp has a great saying, because he says that the more we learn, the less we understand, kind of thing. Yeah. And it's true. You can have a mountain of information and data, but actually the knowledge doesn't necessarily come from that. And that's what I feel that we're at that point now, that we've got so much information about what's been going on, but we're actually no further forward, it seems. I mean, people might correct me if I'm wrong, getting to what the answer is, because it just never seems to come, does it? It's just more tantalizingly out of reach, kind of thing.
Right. Carl Cartesian has a question. Has Graeme? I just see the spelling and want to pronounce it that way. Yeah. Has Graeme discussed the 1930 Italian craft recovery and if pilots were recovered? I'm personally, I've heard of this, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, there's stories about a kind of a supposed retrieval that happened in 1933, I think it is. I'm not across the topic fully, because it happened before the kind of scope of the book. I'm aware of the sort of outline of the story, and there's various supposed proof in terms of telegrams that were sent between various people in the Italian government and the Air Force, etc., in terms of what to do with this equipment and how to stop people, the press getting like stories into the newspapers and things like this. So yes, I understand that things happened, and I've also heard, and I'm not sure if this is correct, that apparently the craft was passed to America, and I can't really get my head around why that would happen. So there's a few things that I've heard about this story that don't necessarily, to me, in terms of the political kind of geography at the time, make sense. But it's one of these things where we've still yet to have all the information. And I know Lou Elizondo has mentioned this in the past, this particular, the information about this. So I'm really at the moment where I need to read more before I could give you a kind of, opinion on what I really think about it. At the moment, what I've read so far, some of it doesn't make sense, but some of it's quite intriguing. And that would again set, the clock even further back in terms of what is really happening, because there are other stories, not just in Italy, but there are stories of retrievals allegedly, and I say that word advisedly, from the Germans have apparently picked something up in Poland in either 37 or 38, which seems preposterous as well, given the kind of state of relationships that the two countries were soon to have. And this is bearing in mind when the Germans were land grabbing throughout Europe, the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia and places like Austria, etc. And there's a few other stories from back then as well for different places. So I'm not sure if it's a kind of, people are making things up, because certainly I go through a lot of things that were made up about things in the war in my book, and whether this is just another one of those or whether there is something to it. And at the moment, I don't know enough to say one way or another, I'm afraid, Danny.
I mean, bless you for saying that answer. I think that's so many people, I think, in this field are okay not having enough evidence, but just assuming it happened. And I think it's really important to be aware and be curious and be in that space of maybe this happened, maybe it didn't. It's curious. We should keep digging, see what turns up, but there isn't enough information right now. And I think it's super important to stay grounded with what evidence is available, because otherwise, you know, this topic can get real murky real quick. So I love that answer. I think that's the perfect answer. And for a lot of things, I think that is the answer, right? You mentioned at the time, Germany was the country with the fastest jet. I kind of wanted you to go into the Horton brothers a little bit, because there's a lot of conspiracy around what Germany could have done and the secret technology that Nazis had. And I just love to read. I was so happy to see someone who has such a knowledge of aviation history and where countries were at that time, and if you could delve into that a little bit, because I think we could maybe put some theories to rest.
Yeah, I mentioned the Hortons in the book. I have a small chapter about the flying wing, the jet fighter that they built. I tried to develop at the end of the war. I think the overall kind of impression that a lot of people have is that the Germans were some kind of Superman when it comes to like secret technology, that they had all these war-winning devices. Now, the truth is slightly less than that, because yes, they had ideas for a lot of things, but actually building it and implementing this technology was something completely different. Now, in terms of the Hortons, yes, they had plans for radical flying wing technology. And before the war, they'd even built gliders to research this kind of flight. And when they came up with the idea of building a jet fighter, a flying wing design, they were all, they tried to get official sponsorship. And actually in Nazi Germany, you couldn't really get very far, even if you had a potentially war-winning weapon, without some kind of official patronage. But they didn't get any. There were two brothers. One had been a fighter pilot early in the war, and the other one's the designer, and they worked together. And it got to the point where basically they were beg, borrowing, and stealing in order to try and get this project off the ground. And at one point, they basically lied to the director of the Junkers engine factory to try and get two jet engines to put into the prototype of the powered aircraft. They built a glider to start with to try and test it. They then had to junk it because they had the wrong dimensions for the engine spaces. And then when they built the next aircraft, all the data that had amassed from the prototype was useless, because the next aircraft they built had the different types of engines in it, because they got the dimensions wrong, because they'd had to blag their way into trying getting these jet engines. So there's all these kind of crazy stories about what they did. They raided supply dumps and crashed aircraft for bits to build the undercarriage for one of the prototypes, and then it crashed as well on a test flight. So and they had a hell of a job trying to even just get the thing built. They built it in a small workshop. They didn't have official sponsorship, so they had to be very creative in building this thing. And then of course the end of the war came before they could build any more. And the production contract for the jet fighter was given to another company called Gotha, who were a subcontractor for a lot of other aircraft during the war. They built aircraft during the First World War, but they didn't have too many designs of their own in the Second World War. And the Hortons didn't like that, and they then decided, okay, we're going to design the same aircraft but ourselves. So there was two versions of the same aircraft at the same time. So therefore they were wasting time on that, as it was like a few months before the end of the war. And 3 months before the end of the war, they were contracted to build an aircraft to bomb America, a flying wing bomber called the America Bomber. The Horton 12, the Horton 13, I can't exactly remember which one it was. And that had four jet engines on it above the wing. So, they were wasting their time on that, because there was no way they were going to build something like that in the time they had left. And with the dwindling amount of resources available to German industry at that time in the war. And then they have other projects where the Messerschmitt 262, the first jet fighter would ever go into service. It was great in the daytime. It was a very, very capable aircraft. But Hitler said it had to carry bombs. So they had to redesign it, and that took several months out of the development. So it got put into service about 6 months after it should have been. It could have gone into service in the winter in the early the early months of 1944. It took until the summer before it finally got into service. The rocket fighter is another one. They built it and it had 2 volatile fuels, one of which could dissolve the pilot alive if it got into contact with his skin. So that was a really dangerous aircraft to fly.
Jeez.
You know, they crashed more of them than they shot down American bombers. So, you know, they were playing with fire a lot of the time. All this radical technology either didn't work, or there was political infighting, or they just couldn't get it to function properly. They built a vertical take. Well, I wrote this for the Debrief a little while ago, an article about a rocket-powered vertical takeoff interceptor that could break off into bits, and they could recycle them because they landed by parachute. There was only ever one manned launch, and it killed the pilot. You know, sort of thing. So they had all this wonderful ideas, but they didn't come to fruition. They had a gun that could shoot round corners. They developed the Krumlauf. It was a gun that literally could shoot around the corner of a building, and they wondered why the bullets came out in bits, because they couldn't go around a barrel that was bent in the middle. So they have all this crazy stuff. There's a real kind of raft of bonkers stuff. They had a wind gun, the wind cannon. They had a sound cannon, but they were too big, too unwieldy, and you couldn't move them around, and they cost thousands of Reichsmarks to try and develop, and they were absolutely useless. And then, of course, you get into the realms of all the kind of cuckoo stuff, the flying discs, which don't exist. I'll just leave that there. They don't exist. They only exist in the imagination of people that came after the war, who said they worked on these projects. They said that for a reason, because they wanted contracts from the Americans to go and work across in America after the war, because Germany was a basket case and they was better off if they worked abroad, but they would be neglected or left behind, or just didn't have the skills. So you get that kind of story. And then you have all these neo-Nazis and fellow travelers leaping on the bandwagon in the 60s who thought it was a great idea to big up Germany's achievements, even though they didn't actually have them, you know. So there's all this you've got to wade through. And what you do, you get back to about a half a dozen different newspaper reports in the early 1950s of people saying, I built a flying disc. It worked. It flew at 1,400 miles an hour in February 1945 in Bohemia. But I can't give you proof. But yes, it did.
Right.
And that's what they say.
And then
that's all it boils down to.
they'd use it. That was true.
Left on it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, you can read through the internet, you know, all the stuff on the Foo-Fighters, and you come across all this other stuff, this garbage that is associated with the Foo-Fighters, and it's just rubbish, because nobody's ever been able to provide a scrap of proof to suggest any of these things ever existed. You know, you would need documentation for materials, for manpower to build them, for testing facilities, you know, for the people to fly them, for places where they would be operated from, and all the information about the operational side of things. None of that exists at all. You know, the Germans were quite bureaucratic. People forget that everything had to be signed in triplicate. You know, it's the old adage, right. You can't do anything until you sign for it. They used to do all that kind of stuff, you know, things that worked on paper. You know, and it was incredibly difficult to get things off the ground in Germany. And even some of these really esoteric projects, the bunker stuff that I mentioned before that you were laughing at, they are actually documented, and yet the discs aren't. So you have to wonder, you know, really how true they are, because nobody, you know, people have tried, and I've got stuff in my inbox occasionally. Oh, you know, Graeme, you don't know what you're talking about. Here's the real truth about the discs. Yeah. And I just look and go, hey, mate, I saw this 30 years ago. You know, stop trying to tell me all this stuff. I've seen it before. You know, I don't respond like that to them. I'm really nice with people when they contact me. But, you know, in my head, I'm just going, I've seen this before, really. You know?
Right. Exactly. That's, you know, this old GeoCities website doesn't really count as standards of evidence. Witness Citizen, and we're wrapping up soon. Witness Citizen had a question. Graeme, did any of these craft have a different kind of weapon other than bullets and bombs, like microwave or other energy?
In World War II? No, it was basically bullets and bombs, and they were experimenting with missiles. So there was rudimentary air-to-air missiles, air-to-surface, and surface-to-air missiles. Germany were at the forefront of that technology as well, but a lot of it wasn't perfected at the end of the war. They did have an operational air-to-air missile, but it wasn't put into service. They did have operational air-to-surface missiles, anti-shipping missiles, which they did use against our ships and yours. And they did have surface-to-air missiles, which were in development, but they pulled the plug on in January 1945 because they devoted resources to other things. So yes, they did have other things. There was an atom bomb project that the Germans worked on, but because Hitler believed it was Jewish physics, they didn't like to do it. So therefore they got so far, but not any further. Even though you can read stuff on the internet, that wonderful tool we all know and love, about a supposed atom bomb test in Pomerania in early 1945. There are supposedly witnesses to this thing. Again, it's a load of rubbish. So, right. Anybody who knows the history of World War II knows that it didn't happen. Despite people trying to come out of the woodwork and say, this thing happened. Well, again, no proof. So, take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. This keeps coming up, what constitutes as proof, I think a lot of people just due to never being taught it or curious, but what standards of evidence mean, and what, if you have a claim, what you really need. It's one thing to say, hey, it could be this, and then to look into it, but to claim something as true without the proper evidence, and a lack of evidence saying, oh, they're covering it up, that's why there's no evidence. I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's true, but if you want to convince anybody of, if you want to convince professionals in academia or in the world of science, that it's not going to work. And so I think it's a good reminder that evidence, all about the evidence. And that's why I love your work so much, because you did the homework, man. You showed up with the receipts. And I think it's important that everyone really acknowledge that. I think you've really done a seminal piece of work here. And you clearly worked your butt off for it. I mean, that is a lot of work. And I just think the community as a whole should really acknowledge all the hard work you put in, because I think it really has really taken the topic a step forward in terms of just our understanding of what's going on. And so I just want to let you know personally from me, and hopefully from others on here, that we really appreciate your hard work.
Thanks, Danny. The thing about the footnotes in the book, I have, as I say, I've left a trail of breadcrumbs so people can see where I get this information from. All those books I mentioned that I used to read in the 70s and 80s, I was frustrated by the lack of sort of information where they got it from. And I was always wanting to read it myself to find out these sources. And, and there was that lack of kind of detail where, but where have you got this information from? And I keep seeing that again and again and again. And I didn't want to be that guy that wrote that book who had, just said, look, this is information I know, but you don't. You have to take it on face value, what I've written. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted people to go and look at where I've got that information from, if you want to, and you can see the context as well. Not just, it's not like I've just cherry picked stuff to suit a narrative, because actually there's no real narrative in the book beyond, look, they're not German secret weapons. And that's the only real narrative I've actually written. Everything else I've left up in the air because genuinely, I don't know what's happening, in terms of World War II. Right. And the Foo-Fighters. I'm pretty sure what they're not, but that's all I can say, and that's as far as I can go. But yes, there's over 1,100 kind of references in the book in terms of where I've got the information from. So hopefully, if nothing else, that shows that it's something that should be, sort of not just immediately dismissed and thrown away. It should be maybe looked at by other people who are maybe more qualified than me to go through this information and look in the archives as well, because there's German archives somewhere that somebody must be able to go through with a fluency in the language and also a fluency in the technical terms and dig information out of there, because I'm afraid my command of the German language is good in terms of military terms, but not in general terms. Sure. And then, of course, there's the American archives, which I've only scratched the surface of, and there's still stuff in the RAF archives, which I haven't seen yet. So, yeah, wow. More work to be done.
Fantastic. Well, kids, we'll leave it at that. Graeme, thank you so much for the time. This hour just flew by. I feel like I could talk to you forever. Is there anything else you want to leave us with? Or, I know you just wrote an entire book, so maybe you just need a break, but is there anything else maybe perhaps you're in the future looking at to work on, or anything you want to leave us with before we head out?
Well, funny enough, people have been asking me even before the book came out, when are you going to write the book on the Pacific War Foo-Fighters? So happy days. I've started that one already. So it's early days here.
Nice.
I really literally only wrote about three. I've wrote about 3 pages of it so far, and 2 of those are introduction. So,
That's
I'm getting into that now. So if people out there have access to, say, their grandfathers, like relatives' records in terms of logbooks, or other information they might have, or, they know of people, then if you get a hold of this information, you can look through it for me and you can pass the details on to me. I'd love to hear from you. I mean, I don't necessarily want kind of like secondhand information about, things that are already out there. It's more this kind of like really good stuff, the kind of pilot information that you probably wouldn't get anywhere else. That's the kind of mother lode. And that's the stuff that's really missing for a lot of the kind of documentation. So that's really what I'm interested in. But all information I'd consider, I'd love for people to get in touch with me. And also, if you've bought the book and you enjoy it, please put a review on Amazon. I'd really appreciate to hear what people think of it. There's only about 5 from the people in the States who have bought it so far. And I know a lot more people have bought the book, and there's about 9 reviews in the UK. So,
wow.
I really love some people to actually put some more on, if you don't mind.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
You heard him, guys. Review that book and buy the book. It's we'll definitely make sure we put the link to the book in the YouTube description too, because really it's worth it, guys. It's worth the read. Support good work. Awesome, Graeme. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great chat. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much, Danny.
My pleasure, man. You have a great one. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
And that's it, everyone. Another episode of Known Quantities in the can. Thank you again for sticking around and listening to this fantastic conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe, rate and review the podcast, buy Graeme's book, review the book. He rocks. Matthew Riot, I agree. Thank you, DOS Tapes, for the groove and music, BlueMarlinChronicles.com. Links to the Patreon are down below. And another show with UCR tomorrow, guys. We'll see you next time. Ta-ta.